I sat at the dinner table, the clinking of forks and knives against plates filling the air as my wife, Melanie, chatted away with her parents. The smell of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes hung around us, a typical Sunday night with the in-laws. Everything felt normal until Melanie set her glass down, looked across the table at me, and dropped the news that turned my stomach cold. "Scott and the kids are moving in with us," she said, her voice steady, like she'd rehearsed it. Not a question, not even a hint of asking me what I thought. Just a fact, delivered like I was supposed to nod and go along with it. I opened my mouth to say something. Anything. But she cut me off before I could get a word out. "It's not up for debate, Liam," she said, her tone sharp, dismissive, like I was a kid who didn't get a vote. I clamped my jaw shut, feeling the heat rise in my chest, my hands tightening around the napkin in my lap. Across the table, Scott smirked. That smug little twist of his lips I'd seen 100 times before, like he'd won something. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his two kids giggling beside him, oblivious to the tension. My in-laws, Marjorie and Tom, beamed at him like he'd just announced he'd cured cancer. "Oh, that's wonderful," Marjorie cooed, clapping her hands together. "Family should stick together." Tom nodded, his eyes flicking to me for half a second before going back to Scott, the golden boy. I could feel their approval radiating across the table, a wall I wasn't allowed to climb. They didn't care what I thought. They never had. And Melanie? She just picked up her fork and kept eating, like it was all settled. I didn't say a word. Not because I agreed. God, no. I didn't say anything because I'd already made my move, and they had no idea what was coming. A month ago, I'd sold the house. My house. The one I'd paid for with every overtime shift, every late night. Every penny I'd scraped together while Scott was out there blowing his money on whatever mess he'd gotten himself into this time. I'd signed the papers in secret, met with the realtor on my lunch breaks, and kept it all locked up tight. The new owners were set to move in next week. Melanie thought she could steamroll me into letting her deadbeat brother and his kids take over our lives. She had no clue I'd already pulled the rug out from under her. I stared at my plate, the chicken growing cold, and let the conversation swirl around me. Scott started talking about how great it'd be to have more space for the kids, how he'd been meaning to get back on his feet. Lies I'd heard before, excuses I'd stopped believing years ago. Melanie chimed in, saying how she'd already planned to turn my office, the one room in the house that was mine, into a bedroom for the kids. My office, where I kept my books, my desk, the only place I could escape to when her family got too loud. She didn't even look at me when she said it, like I wasn't sitting right there. Like I didn't matter. I took a slow sip of water, letting the coolness steady me. They could plan all they wanted. They could pat Scott on the back and tell him how perfect he was. It didn't change a thing. In my head, I pictured the realtor handing me the check, the weight of it in my hands, the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd taken control. I'd spent years bending over backwards for this family, swallowing my pride while they treated me like a doormat. Not anymore. They'd find out soon enough, when the moving trucks rolled up and the locks were changed. I almost smiled at the thought, but I kept my face blank. Let them enjoy their little victory lap tonight. It'd be the last one they got. The dinner dragged on, Marjorie gushing about how lucky Scott was to have us, Tom grunting his agreement. Melanie reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, probably thinking it was some kind of peace offering. I didn't squeeze back. I just sat there, silent, counting down the days until the truth hit them like a freight train. They thought they had me figured out, good old Liam, the guy who'd roll over and take it. But I'd been planning this for weeks, and it felt good. Better than good. It felt like freedom. As the meal ended and the plates were cleared, I leaned back in my chair, watching Scott laugh with his kids, watching Melanie smile like everything was perfect. They had no idea the storm I'd set in motion, and I wasn't going to warn them. Not yet. Let them figure it out the hard way. I sat on the couch in my new apartment, a cold beer in my hand, staring out the window at the city lights flickering in the distance. It was quiet here, peaceful in a way our old house never was. That house, the one I'd poured everything into, wasn't mine anymore, and I didn't miss it. Not one bit. But tonight, my mind kept drifting back to how it all got to this point, how I'd spent a lifetime playing second place to Scott, Melanie's brother, the golden child, the guy who could do no wrong, even when he did everything wrong. I took a sip of my beer, letting the bitter taste settle, and thought about how unfair it had always been. Growing up, I wasn't part of their family, not yet. I met Melanie in college, fell for her fast, and thought I'd hit the jackpot. She was smart, funny, beautiful. But then I met Scott, and it didn't take long to see the pattern. He was the center of their world. Her parents treated him like he walked on water, even when he screwed up. Failed a class? They paid for a tutor. Crashed his car? They bought him a new one. Got fired from a job, again? They'd just shrug and say, he'll figure it out. Meanwhile, I was busting my ass working 2 jobs to pay for school, saving every dime, building something for myself. Nobody bailed me out. Nobody ever had to. When Melanie and I got married, I thought things might change. I thought I'd be part of the family, not just some guy on the sidelines. But it didn't work that way. Scott stayed the star, and I was the responsible one, the one who had to pick up the pieces. We bought the house 5 years ago, and it was my money that made it happen. I'd worked overtime for months, skipped vacations, cut corners where I could. Melanie helped pick the paint colors and the furniture, sure, but the down payment? That was mine. I remember the day we moved in, how proud I felt standing in the driveway, keys in my hand, thinking this was ours. My mistake was thinking Scott wouldn't find a way to claim it too. It started small. He'd show up unannounced, kids in tow, acting like the place was his personal hotel. Just staying for the weekend, he'd say, but the weekend turned into a week, then 2. Melanie never said no. He's family, she'd tell me, like that explained everything. Her parents backed her up every time. Marjorie would call, her voice all syrupy sweet, saying, Liam, you're so good to take care of Scott. He's lucky to have you. Take care of him? I wasn't his damn babysitter. But they drilled it into Melanie's head that I owed him something, that I had to step up because he wouldn't. And me? I just kept quiet, paid the bills, fixed the messes he left behind, crayon marks on the walls, broken toys scattered everywhere, empty beer cans in my trash. I sacrificed a lot for that marriage. Gave up a job offer in Boston because Melanie didn't want to move. Skipped nights out with friends because Scott needed a place to crash. I even let them talk me into loaning him money. $5,000 once, then another 2. Never saw a dime back. Every time, I told myself it was for her, for us. But deep down, I knew the truth. Nobody was sacrificing for me. Not Melanie, not her parents, not Scott. They took, and I let them because I didn't want to rock the boat. I didn't want to lose her. So I stayed quiet, swallowed my frustration, and kept going. Years of it. Years of being the guy who didn't matter. I set the beer down on the coffee table and leaned back, closing my eyes. I could still see Scott's face from that dinner, that smirk when Melanie said he was moving in. He didn't even ask, just assumed I'd roll over like always. And Melanie? She didn't hesitate to side with him, to shut me down before I could argue. That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't my family. They didn't see me as equal. I was the bank, the landlord, the fix-it guy. Nothing more. I'd spent years building that house, that life, and they thought they could just take it because Scott was Scott. Selling the house wasn't some impulsive thing. I'd been thinking about it for months, turning it over in my head every time Scott showed up or Melanie brushed me off. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering why I was still doing it, why I was still playing second place. The day I called the realtor, I felt a weight lift off me. It wasn't just about the house. It was about taking back what was mine. My life. My choices. Scott could have his golden child crown, and Melanie could keep defending him. I was done. Done being the responsible one who got nothing in return. Done being invisible in my own home. I opened my eyes, grabbed the beer again, and smiled. They'd figure out soon enough that I wasn't playing their game anymore. And I couldn't wait to watch it all fall apart. I woke up to the sun streaming through the blinds of my new apartment, a small place I'd rented after selling the house. It was a Saturday morning, 3 months since that dinner where Melanie dropped her bombshell about Scott moving in. The coffee maker hummed in the kitchen, filling the air with that rich smell I loved. I just poured myself a mug and settled into the armchair by the window when my phone started buzzing on the table. I glanced at it, Marjorie's name flashing on the screen. Melanie's mom. I let it ring, figuring she'd leave a voicemail about some family thing I didn't care about anymore. But it didn't stop. 1 call, then 2, then 3. By the 5th, my curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up, bracing myself for whatever nonsense was coming. Liam. Marjorie's voice exploded through the phone, high-pitched and frantic. Scott and the kids just got to your house. And there's someone else living there. What's going on? Where are you? I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth slide down my throat, and leaned back in the chair. I could picture her standing there, hands on her hips, her face red with panic. Scott probably hovering nearby, confused but still acting like he owned the place. The kids running around, making noise. I didn't say anything for a second, just let her stew in her own worry. Liam, are you listening? She snapped, her voice climbing higher. What happened to the house? Yes, Marjorie, I said finally, keeping my tone calm, steady, like we were talking about the weather. That's because I sold the house. I heard her gasp, a sharp little sound, and then nothing. Silence. For once, she didn't have a quick comeback. I took another sip of coffee, savoring it, waiting for the explosion I knew was coming. And then it hit, screaming, loud and wild, like I'd just set fire to her whole world. You what? How could you do this? What about Melanie? What about Scott? Where are they supposed to go? Her words tumbled over each other, fast and messy, but I didn't flinch. I'd been ready for this. I set the mug down on the table, leaned forward, and pressed the end call button. The phone went quiet, cutting her off mid-rant. I didn't need to hear the rest. I could guess it all. Accusations, guilt trips, the same old song they'd been singing for years. I wasn't in the mood to play along. Not today. Not ever again. I stood up, stretched, and walked to the kitchen to refill my coffee. The apartment was small, just a one-bedroom with a tiny balcony, but it was mine. No Scott, no kids, no in-laws barging in. Just me and my thoughts. I glanced at my phone as it buzzed again. Marjorie, of course. I ignored it, letting it vibrate itself silly on the counter. I knew what was happening back at the old house. Scott would have pulled up in that beat-up van of his, the one with the dented fender he never fixed. He'd have his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the kids spilling out of the back seat, probably thinking they were moving into some big adventure. Melanie might have been there too, or maybe she was still at her parents' place, planning how to fix me later. They'd walk up to the door, knock, and find out the locks were changed. Some stranger, probably the nice couple I'd sold it to, would answer, confused, maybe a little annoyed. Who are you? They'd ask, and Scott wouldn't have an answer. He'd stand there, dumbstruck, that smirk wiped clean off his face. I could almost see it, and it made me grin. I'd sold the house to a young couple, early 30s, no kids. They'd loved it, the big yard, the open kitchen, the quiet street. I didn't tell them why I was selling, just said I was moving on. They didn't need to know about Scott or Melanie or any of it. The deal went smooth, cash offer, quick closing. I'd packed up my stuff weeks ago, moved out while Melanie was at work. She hadn't even noticed the missing boxes, too busy planning Scott's big arrival. That was her mistake, thinking I'd just sit there and take it. She'd underestimated me, and now they were all scrambling. I walked out onto the balcony, coffee in hand, and leaned against the railing. The city stretched out below, cars humming along, people going about their lives. I wondered how long it'd take Melanie to call me herself. Marjorie would have told her by now, probably crying, making it sound like I'd ruined everything. Scott would be mad, but he'd expect someone else to fix it, same as always. I didn't feel bad, though, not even a little. They'd had years to treat me like I mattered, and they didn't. This was on them. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't check it. I stayed out there, breathing in the crisp morning air, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. They could stew in it. Marjorie, Scott, all of them. I wasn't running back to explain myself or smooth things over. I'd made my choice, and it felt right. The house was gone, and with it, all the weight I'd been carrying. Let them figure out what to do next. I was done being the one who fixed their messes. For once, I was the one watching from the outside, and it was a damn good view. I was driving through the old neighborhood that afternoon, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the street. I didn't plan to stop by the house, my house, or what used to be mine, but something pulled me there, an itch I couldn't scratch. I turned onto our old road, slowing down as I got closer, and there it was. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut, but not in a bad way. Scott stood out front, his duffel bags dumped on the curb, his two kids kicking at the grass like they didn't know what to do. His rusty van was parked crooked, stuffed to the roof with junk, clothes, toys, whatever he'd managed to cram in there. I pulled over a block away, far enough that they wouldn't see me, and just watched. Scott looked lost, his hands on his hips, staring at the house like it had betrayed him. The new owners must have already told him to get lost. Maybe they'd even threatened to call the cops. His kids were whining, tugging at his shirt, but he just shook them off, pacing back and forth. Then I saw Melanie. She stepped out of her car, phone pressed to her ear, her face twisted with anger. She was yelling, I could tell, even from this distance. Her hair was a mess, like she'd been running her hands through it all day, and her shoulders were hunched, tight with frustration. I didn't need to hear her to know who she was calling. Me. She'd been blowing up my phone since Marjorie's meltdown that morning, but I hadn't picked up. Not yet. I leaned back in my seat, the engine idling soft, and let it all sink in. This was their mess now, not mine. Scott kicked one of his bags, muttering something I couldn't hear, and the kids started chasing each other around the yard. The new owner's car was in the driveway, a shiny blue sedan, a far cry from Scott's junker. I wondered what they thought of this circus showing up on their doorstep. Probably confused, maybe a little pissed. They'd bought a quiet house on a quiet street, not a front row seat to the Scott show. Melanie hung up the phone, stared at it for a second, then started dialing again. I felt my pocket buzz, but I didn't reach for it. Let her wait. Watching them unravel like this, it was better than I'd imagined. Scott's entitlement was crumbling right there on the curb. He'd walked up to that door thinking it was his, same as always, and now he had nowhere to go. Melanie, too. She'd been so sure she could just decide things, like I didn't get a say. Now they were both stuck, flailing, and I wasn't lifting a finger to help. I rolled down my window a crack, letting the cool air slip in, and took a deep breath. It smelled like freedom, like the end of something I'd been dragging around too long. I remembered the day I'd handed over the keys. The realtor had smiled, the new couple had thanked me, and I'd walked away without looking back. I didn't tell them about Scott or Melanie or any of it, just said I was moving on. They didn't need the details. The house wasn't my problem anymore, and seeing Scott's stuff piled up on the grass proved it. He'd probably expected me to cave, to let him crash there anyway, like all the times before. Not this time. Not ever again. Melanie stormed over to him, waving her arms, her voice carrying faint snatches of, "What are we supposed to do?" Scott just shrugged, that lazy shrug he always did when he didn't have an answer. Typical. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, feeling a calm settle over me. This was the most peaceful I'd felt in years. No more late-night arguments with Melanie about her brother. No more stepping over his kids' toys in my own living room. No more pretending I was okay with being the guy who paid for everything while Scott coasted. I'd spent so long trying to keep the peace, to make it work, and for what? They'd never cared what I thought. But now, sitting here, watching them fall apart, I realized I didn't have to care either. Not anymore. A part of me wondered if I should feel guilty. Melanie was my wife, after all, or had been, depending on how you looked at it. We'd built a life together, or at least I'd thought we had. But that life was always more hers than mine, more her family's than ours. Selling the house wasn't just about sticking it to Scott. It was about taking back what was mine. My money, my hard work, my sanity. She'd made her choice at that dinner, picking him over me without a second thought. Now she was living it, and I was watching from the sidelines, finally free. Scott started loading his bags back into the van, barking at the kids to get in. Melanie stood there, arms crossed, glaring at the house like it had personally insulted her. My phone buzzed again, but I let it go to voicemail. I didn't need to hear her yelling, her demands, her excuses. I'd heard enough over the years. I started the car, the engine purring soft, and pulled away slow, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. The chaos faded in my rearview mirror. Scott's van, Melanie's pacing, all of it shrinking smaller and smaller until it was gone. I turned up the radio, some old rock song I hadn't heard in forever, and let it fill the silence. This was my day now, my life. And it felt damn good. I was halfway through a sandwich at my new apartment, the TV humming low in the background, when my phone lit up again. Melanie's name flashed on the screen. She'd been calling nonstop since that morning when Marjorie freaked out, probably leaving voicemails I hadn't bothered to check. I'd seen her pacing outside the old house earlier, furious, and I figured she'd cool off eventually. But now, sitting in my quiet living room, I decided to pick up. Not because I wanted to fix anything, just because I was curious. I wiped my hands on a napkin, hit the answer button, and braced myself for the storm. "Liam, how could you sell our home without telling me?" Her voice came through loud, shaking with anger, like she'd been holding it in all day, just waiting to unload. I leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling, and let her keep going. Do you have any idea what you've done? Scott and the kids showed up, and there's strangers living there. Strangers, Liam. Where are we supposed to go? What am I supposed to do now? She was shouting so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear for a second. I could picture her, face red, eyes wild, probably standing somewhere chaotic with Scott whining in the background. I waited until she paused, sucking in a breath, and then I spoke, keeping my voice even. You mean the same way you told me Scott and his kids were moving in, without my input? I said it slow, letting each word land. She went quiet, and I could almost hear her brain scrambling for a comeback. She hadn't expected me to throw it back at her like that. For years, I'd let her roll over me, let her make the calls while I nodded and paid the bills. Not this time. I'd had a month to think about that dinner, about how she'd shut me down without a flicker of doubt, and I was done playing nice. Liam, that's not. She started, stumbling over her words, but I cut her off. No, Melanie, it's exactly the same. You decided what was happening to our house, my house, without even asking me. So I decided something too. I heard her huff, a sharp little sound, like she couldn't believe I was talking back. You don't get it, she snapped. This isn't just about Scott. This is our life, our home, and you just threw it away. Her voice cracked, and for a second, I wondered if she'd cry. But then she kept going, harder. Where are we supposed to live, Liam? Tell me that. Where am I supposed to go? I sat up, resting my elbows on my knees, and let a beat pass before I answered. I don't know, Melanie. Maybe Scott will take you in. I said it flat, no venom, just the truth. She'd spent years propping him up, letting him lean on us, on me, while I got nothing but headaches. If she was so worried about a place to live, she could figure it out with her precious brother. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just heavy breathing on the other end, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. You're unbelievable, she finally muttered, low and bitter. After everything we've been through, you'd do this to me? I almost laughed, but I held it in. Everything we'd been through? She meant everything I'd put up with, her family, her rules, her brother crashing into our lives whenever he felt like it. You did this to yourself, I said, standing up and walking to the window. I looked out at the city, the lights blinking in the dusk, and felt that calm wash over me again. You made your choice at that dinner. You picked Scott, not me. Now you get to deal with it. I didn't wait for her to respond. I hung up, tossing the phone onto the couch, and grabbed my sandwich again. The line went dead, and the silence felt good. I took a bite, chewing slow, and thought about how this argument should have happened years ago. Back when Scott first started showing up uninvited, eating my food, leaving his mess everywhere. Or when Melanie let him borrow money we didn't have, money I'd worked for, and never blinked when he didn't pay it back. I should have said something then, put my foot down, told her I wasn't her family's doormat. But I didn't. I kept quiet, thinking that's what you do when you love someone. You compromise, you sacrifice. Except it was always me compromising, always me sacrificing, and she never noticed. Now she knew what it felt like to be disregarded, to have someone else call the shots, and leave you standing there with nothing. Selling the house wasn't just about getting rid of Scott. It was about showing her I had limits. I'd reached mine that night at dinner, when she looked me in the eye and said it wasn't up for debate. Like I was nothing. Like my say didn't matter. I finished my sandwich, wiped my hands, and sat back down, the TV still muttering some sitcom I wasn't really watching. My phone stayed quiet after that. No more calls, no texts. Maybe she was too mad to try again, or maybe she was finally realizing she couldn't talk her way out of this one. I didn't care either way. I'd said what I needed to say, and it felt like a weight off my chest. For once, she was the one scrambling, the one left out in the cold. I turned off the TV, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and stepped onto the balcony. The night air was cool, the city buzzing soft below me. This was my space now, my life. Melanie could yell all she wanted, but I wasn't going back. Not to her, not to that house, not to any of it. She'd learned to live with her choices, just like I'd learned to live with mine. And mine felt right. I woke up the next morning to my phone buzzing like a swarm of bees on the nightstand. The sun was barely up, light creeping through the blinds of my new apartment, and I groaned, rubbing my eyes. I'd slept better than I had in months. No late-night arguments, no kids running down the hall, just quiet. But now the peace was gone, shattered by that insistent vibration. I grabbed the phone, squinting at the screen. Missed calls: 5 from Marjorie, 3 from Tom, 2 from Scott, and 1 from Brittany, Melanie's loudmouth best friend who'd never liked me. No surprise there. I tossed the phone back down, figuring they'd give up eventually, and rolled out of bed to make coffee. They didn't give up. By the time I'd poured my first cup, the calls started again. Marjorie first, then Tom, then Scott. I ignored them all, letting the voicemails pile up while I sipped my coffee and watched the city wake up outside my window. I knew what they wanted: to yell, to beg, to guilt me into fixing the mess I'd made by selling the house. But I wasn't in the mood to listen. I'd said my piece to Melanie last night, and that was enough. The phone buzzed again, Brittany this time, and I sighed, setting my mug down. Might as well get it over with. I picked up, steeling myself for the onslaught. "Liam, you selfish jerk." Brittany's voice hit me like a slap, sharp and dripping with venom. "You put my sister in an impossible position. How could you do this to her? To her family?" I leaned against the counter, staring at the coffee maker, and let her rant. She went on about Melanie being devastated, about Scott and the kids having nowhere to go, about how I'd destroyed everything. Her words came fast, like she'd been rehearsing them, and I could picture her pacing her apartment, flipping her hair like she always did when she was mad. "You're heartless," she hissed. "Completely heartless." "No," I said, cutting her off mid-sentence, my voice calm but firm. "She did that herself." Brittany stopped, caught off guard, and I kept going. "Melanie decided Scott was moving in without asking me. She made that call, not me. I just did what I had to do." There was a long pause, just her breathing on the other end, and I could tell she was scrambling for something to say. "You don't get it," she finally snapped. "She's your wife. You're supposed to support her, not pull the rug out from under her." I almost laughed, but I held it back. Support her? Like I hadn't been doing that for years while her family walked all over me? "Brittany, I'm done talking about this," I said, and hung up before she could fire back. The phone went silent, and I rubbed my temples, feeling the start of a headache. But it didn't end there. Next came Tom, Melanie's dad, his deep voice booming through the speaker when I made the mistake of answering. "You're a disgrace to this family, Liam," he growled, like he was some judge passing sentence. "Selling that house behind our backs? Leaving Melanie and Scott in the lurch? I didn't think you'd stoop this low." I let him talk, stirring my coffee, waiting for him to wind down. "You need to fix this," he finished, his tone heavy with expectation. "I'm not fixing anything," I said, keeping it short. "They made their bed. Let them lie in it." I hung up again, cutting off his sputtered reply. The calls kept coming. Marjorie sobbing about poor Scott. Scott himself whining that I'd screwed him over. Each one tried a different angle. Tears, anger, shame. The guilt trips were relentless, piling up like bricks they wanted me to carry. "You've ruined Melanie's life," Marjorie cried. "You owe us better than this," Scott muttered. It was the same old playbook. Make me feel like the bad guy so I'd cave and clean up their mess. But I didn't cave. Not this time. I turned the phone on silent, tossed it onto the couch, and finished my coffee in peace. They could scream all they wanted. I wasn't budging. I'd spent years bending to their demands, letting them pile their problems on me while I got nothing but grief. Scott's handouts, Melanie's excuses, her parents' lectures. I was done with it all. I rinsed my mug in the sink, the hot water steaming up the air, and thought about how they'd never seen this coming. They thought I'd just take it, like always. Good old Liam, the pushover. Not anymore. I stepped out onto the balcony, the morning air cool against my skin, and looked down at the street below. People were starting their day, joggers, dog walkers, cars rolling by. My life was different now, and I wasn't going back. The pressure from Melanie's family was heavy, sure, but it wasn't my burden to carry. They'd figure it out, or they wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't my problem. I leaned on the railing, feeling the metal cold under my hands, and let out a long breath. The headache was fading, replaced by something lighter, something free. I went back inside, grabbed my keys, and decided to head out for a walk. The apartment was mine, the day was mine, and I wasn't letting their noise ruin it. They could keep calling, keep blaming me, but I was out of their reach now. For the first time in a long time, I felt solid, like I was standing on ground I'd built myself. Let them stew. Let them yell. I wasn't picking up the pieces anymore. This was my line in the sand, and I wasn't crossing it. Not for them. Not for anyone. I stood in my new apartment, the late afternoon sun spilling through the big windows, painting the hardwood floor in warm gold. It was a modern place in the city, sleek, quiet, with a view of the skyline that stretched out like a promise. I'd moved in a couple weeks ago, after the house sold, and every day here felt like a fresh start. No more Scott's mess, no more Melanie's family breathing down my neck. Just me, my stuff, my rules. I walked over to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and leaned against the counter, letting my mind settle. Instead of dwelling on their chaos, I was building something new, and it felt good, better than good. It felt like mine. The place wasn't huge, just a one-bedroom with a small living area and a balcony, but it was perfect. The walls were clean white, the furniture simple, nothing cluttered or loud. I'd picked out a gray couch, a coffee table, a bed with a frame that didn't creak. No hand-me-downs from Melanie's parents. No kid-scratch junk from Scott. I'd left all that behind when I packed up, taking only what mattered. My clothes, my books, my old guitar I hadn't played in years. The rest? Sold or dumped. I didn't need reminders of the old life dragging me down. This apartment was a clean slate, and I was writing the story on it. Work was part of that new story, too. I'd gotten a promotion a few days ago, something I'd been chasing for months, but never told Melanie about. It came with a corner office in Boston, a 20% raise, and a title that felt like it fit me: Senior Project Manager. I'd been stuck in the same mid-level job for years, grinding away while Scott mooched and Melanie brushed off my complaints. But I'd put in the hours, stayed late, pitched ideas that finally got noticed. The day my boss called me in to tell me, I'd sat there, nodding, feeling a quiet pride I hadn't felt in a long time. "You've earned this, Liam," he'd said, shaking my hand. I believed him. I'd start next month, and I was already planning the move. New city, new job, new everything. I took a sip of water, cool and crisp, and walked over to the window. The city buzzed below, cars honking, people crossing streets, lights flickering on as the day faded. I'd always wanted to live somewhere like this, somewhere alive, but Melanie hated the idea. Too noisy, she'd say, or too far from mom and dad. So I'd stayed put, in that house on that quiet street, for her. For them. Not anymore. Boston was my choice, and I couldn't wait to get there. The raise would cover the rent on a bigger place, maybe one with a view of the harbor. I'd have space to breathe, to think, to be me without someone else's shadow hanging over me. Freedom was the real win, though. That's what hit me hardest as I stood there, glass in hand, watching the world move. I was free from Scott, free from his late-night knocks on the door, his "just one more favor" crap that never ended. Free from Melanie's family obligations, the endless dinners where I was expected to smile and nod while they fawned over him. Free from being the second choice, the guy who paid the bills and fixed the problems, but never got a say. I set the glass down on the sill and ran a hand through my hair, feeling lighter than I had in years. This was what I'd been missing: control, peace, a life that didn't revolve around someone else's needs. I grabbed my guitar from the corner, dusted it off, and sat on the couch. I hadn't played since before we bought the house, back when I had time for things I loved. My fingers were rusty, fumbling over the strings, but I picked out a few chords, letting the sound fill the room. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I thought about how Melanie used to roll her eyes when I played. "Too loud," she'd complain, or "Can't you do that later?" Scott would laugh, make some crack about me thinking I was a rock star. I'd stopped playing after a while, packed the guitar away, let it gather dust. But now I could play whenever I damn well wanted, and nobody was here to stop me. The phone sat silent on the coffee table, no buzzing, no calls. They'd given up for now, or maybe they were too busy fighting each other to bother me. I didn't care. I strummed another chord, louder this time, and grinned. This was my space, my time. I'd spent years shrinking myself to fit into their world, making myself smaller so they could feel big. No more. I set the guitar down, stood up, and walked to the balcony. The air was cool, the city sprawling out below me, and I felt solid, like I was finally standing tall. I thought about the move to Boston, the new office, the life I was building. Friends I'd lost touch with were already texting, asking to meet up once I got there. I'd have nights out, weekends to myself, maybe even start playing music again for real. No more excuses, no more family-first guilt trips. I leaned on the railing, watching the lights twinkle, and realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. For the first time in years, I was living on my own terms, and it was everything I'd hoped it'd be. The past was gone, sold off with that house, and the future? It was wide open, and it was mine. I was sitting at my new desk, sorting through some papers for the Boston move, when my phone rang. It was late afternoon, the apartment quiet except for the hum of traffic outside. I glanced at the screen. Melanie's name stared back at me. It had been 2 months since I'd last seen her pacing outside the old house. 2 months since the blowout calls from her family. I'd figured she'd moved on, or at least stopped trying to drag me back into her mess. Curiosity got the better of me, so I picked up, leaning back in my chair, ready for whatever she had to say. Her voice came through, soft, not angry like before. "Liam, it's me," she said, and I could hear the weight in it. Something different, something broken. "Hey," I said, keeping it neutral. I wasn't mad anymore, just detached, like I was talking to someone I used to know. She didn't yell or accuse me this time. Instead, she let out a long breath and said, "I made a mistake." I raised an eyebrow, even though she couldn't see it, and waited. "Scott, he's been a disaster," she went on, her words slow, like she was picking them carefully. "He burned through his savings in weeks, quit his job again, and he's been expecting me to pay for everything. Rent, food, the kids. I can't keep up." Her voice cracked, and I could tell she was close to tears. "Mom and Dad aren't helping either. They just keep saying he'll figure it out, but he won't. He never does." I set the papers down, staring at the wall, letting her words sink in. This wasn't the Melanie I'd fought with 2 months ago, the one who'd screamed at me for selling the house, who defended Scott like he was some saint. This was someone else, someone worn down, finally seeing what I'd seen for years. "I shouldn't have let them treat you like that," she said quietly, almost a whisper. "I didn't realize how much I leaned on you, how much I let Scott take. I'm sorry, Liam." There it was, genuine regret, raw and real, cutting through the line. I hadn't expected it, and for a second, I didn't know what to say. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. The sun was dipping low, turning the skyline orange and pink. "Yeah, well," I started, keeping my tone steady. "It's a little late for that." I wasn't trying to be cruel, just honest. She'd had years to see it, years to stand up for me instead of her brother, and she didn't. That dinner was just the last straw, not the first. "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I messed up. I didn't see it until now, until he dragged me down with him. I thought I was helping family, but I was hurting you instead." I leaned against the glass, feeling the coolness through my shirt, and thought about what she was saying. Scott had always been a leech, quitting jobs, blowing money, leaning on everyone else to prop him up. I'd watched it happen, paid for it happen, while Melanie and her parents turned a blind eye. Now he'd done it to her too, and she was stuck, probably in some cramped apartment, juggling bills she couldn't afford, while he sat back like nothing was wrong. "He hasn't changed," I said, more to myself than her. "He never will." "No," she agreed, sounding defeated. "He hasn't. And I let him get away with it for too long. I let them all get away with it." I could hear the kids in the background, their voices faint, probably running around while Scott did nothing. It painted a picture I knew too well. Chaos she couldn't control, a life she'd chosen over me. "I don't know what to do, Liam," she said, and I could tell she was waiting for something. For me to step in, maybe, to offer a fix like I always had. But I didn't. "That's not my problem anymore," I said, not harsh, just clear. "You picked him, Melanie. You decided he came first. Now you're living with it." There was a long silence, just her breathing on the other end, and I knew she didn't have a comeback. She couldn't argue with the truth. I'd spent years cleaning up after Scott, keeping the peace, holding everything together while she nodded along to her parents' excuses. Selling the house was my way out, and I wasn't stepping back in. Not for her, not for anyone. "I just wanted you to know I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice small. "I don't expect you to fix this. I needed to say it." I nodded to myself, staring out at the fading light. "Okay," I said. "I hear." That was all I gave her. No promises, no softening. I hung up, setting the phone on the sill, and let the quiet settle back in. Her apology didn't change anything, not really. It was too late to undo the years I'd spent in Scott's shadow, the years she'd let me fade into the background. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped it open, and stepped onto the balcony. The air was cool, the city humming below me, and I felt steady, solid in a way I hadn't before. Melanie's breaking point wasn't my burden. She'd seen Scott for what he was, but it didn't erase what she'd done. I took a sip, letting the cold wash over me, and thought about how far I'd come. New job, new place, new life. Her regret was hers to carry, not mine. I leaned on the railing, watching the lights blink on one by one, and felt the past slip further away. This was my time now, and I wasn't giving it up for anyone. I was finishing a coffee at my apartment, the morning sun streaming in, when Melanie texted me. "Can we meet? I need to talk. In person." It had been a few days since her call, the one where she'd sounded broken, admitting her mistakes about Scott. I stared at the message, thumb hovering over the screen, debating. I wasn't itching to see her, not after everything, but something in me wanted to know how bad it had gotten. Not because I was thinking of going back, those days were done, but because I wanted to see the fallout with my own eyes. I typed back, "Okay, where?" She replied quick, suggesting a diner near her parents' place, neutral ground. I agreed, grabbed my keys, and headed out, curious but guarded. The drive was short, the city slipping by in a blur of gray buildings and honking cars. I pulled into the diner lot, parked, and walked in, the bell above the door jingling. Melanie was already there, sitting in a booth near the back, her hands wrapped around a mug like it was keeping her warm. She looked tired, bags under her eyes, hair pulled back messy, shoulders slumped. Scott's kids were with her, running around the table, knocking sugar packets onto the floor. Then I saw him, Scott, slouched in the booth across from her, smirking like nothing had changed. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face blank and slid into the seat opposite them. "Liam," Melanie said, her voice soft, almost nervous. "Thanks for coming." I nodded, not saying much, just watching. The kids darted past, one of them bumping my leg, and Scott laughed, like it was all a big joke. Melanie shot him a look, then turned back to me. "I wanted to talk about everything," she said, fumbling for words. "About what I said on the phone. I meant it. I messed up, and I'm trying to figure things out." Her eyes flicked to Scott, then back to me, pleading, like she wanted me to understand. But before I could respond, Scott leaned forward, his smirk widening. "You owe her another chance, man," he said, his voice loud, cocky. "She stood by you for years. Don't act like you're some saint here." I stared at him, feeling that old heat rise in my chest, the same anger I'd buried for too long. He sat there, arms crossed, like he still thought he could run the show, same old Scott, entitled as ever. Melanie winced, reaching out to shush him, but he waved her off. "What? It's true. He bailed on you, Mel. Left you high and dry. That's not what a husband does." I laughed, a short, sharp sound that made them both freeze. "No, Scott," I said, leaning in, my voice low and steady. "She stood by you. I was just in the way." His smirk faltered, and I kept going, looking straight at him. "You've been mooching off her, off me, off everyone for years. She picked you over me every time, and I'm done being the guy who picks up the pieces." I turned to Melanie, her face pale, eyes wide. "You wanted to talk? Fine. But don't expect me to nod along while he spins this like I'm the bad guy." "Liam, she started, but Scott cut her off, slamming a hand on the table. The kids stopped running, staring at us. "You think you're better than me?" he snapped. "Selling the house out from under us? That's low, even for you. We're family, man. You don't do that to family." I could feel the diner's eyes on us now, the waitress glancing over, but I didn't care. I leaned closer, locking eyes with him. "You're not my family," I said, slow and clear. "You're a leech. Always have been. And she let you be." Melanie's hands shook around her mug, her voice breaking in. "Stop it, both of you. This isn't why I asked you here." She looked at me, desperate. "I'm not asking you to come back. I know that's over. I needed you to see I'm trying to fix this. Scott's leaving soon. I told him he has to go. I can't do it anymore." Scott snorted, rolling his eyes, but she ignored him. "I wanted you to know I get it now. What I did to you. What they all did." I sat back, studying her. She looked like she meant it, but Scott's presence, the chaos of the kids, the way he still acted like he owned the room, told me nothing had really changed. "Good for you," I said, not soft, not hard, just flat. "But that doesn't fix what happened. You chose him, Melanie. You're still choosing him, even now." sitting here with him while he talks like he's got to say. She opened her mouth, but I shook my head. I didn't come here to argue. I came to see what you wanted. And I see it. Same mess, different day. Scott muttered something under his breath, but I didn't bite. I stood up, pushing the chair back. I hope you figure it out, I said to her, meaning it in a distant way. But I'm not part of this anymore. She stared at me, tears welling up, but didn't try to stop me. Scott glared, like he wanted to say more, but I was already done. I walked out, the bell jingling again, and stepped into the cool air outside. The diner faded behind me as I got in my car, started the engine, and pulled away. I didn't feel bad leaving. She'd unraveled, sure, but Scott was still there, still smug, still thinking he could control the narrative. That was her fight now, not mine. I turned up the radio, letting the music drown out the echo of their voices, and drove back to my life. My real life, the one I'd built without them. This was my choice, and it felt right. They could keep their chaos. I was out. I walked out of that diner with my head clear, the weight of Melanie's words and Scott's smug face fading behind me as the door swung shut. The drive back to my apartment was quiet, just the hum of the engine and the soft crackle of the radio filling the space. I didn't feel torn or guilty, not like I might have years ago. I'd gone to see her, heard her out, and left with no regrets. She'd chosen Scott over me, time and again, and now she was stuck with the consequences. I pulled into my parking spot, cut the engine, and sat there for a minute, letting the stillness settle. This was it, my line in the sand. I was done looking back. The next few days passed easy, like a weight I didn't even know I'd been carrying was finally gone. I packed for Boston, sorting through clothes and books, picking what I'd take to the new place. The apartment was still bare, just the basics, but it felt right, clean, mine, no trace of the old life. I'd shipped some stuff ahead already, and the rest would fit in my car. Work called a few times, finalizing details for the promotion, start date, office setup, all that. I'd be there in a week, stepping into that corner office with a view, a fresh slate. Every time I thought about it, I grinned. This was what I'd worked for, what I'd earned, and nobody could take it from me. About 6 months later, I was settled in Boston, sitting on my new couch with a beer in hand, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jake, an old buddy from college I'd reconnected with after the move. Heard some stuff about Melanie, it read. You want to know? I took a sip, debating. Part of me didn't care. Her life wasn't my business anymore, but curiosity won out. Sure, I texted back. A minute later, he called, his voice crackling through the line. Man, it's a mess, he said, laughing a little. Scott mooched off her hard. Rent, food, everything, until she finally kicked him out. Took her months, though. Word is he's crashing with some friend now, still jobless. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Figures, I said, not surprised. Scott was a leech. He'd bleed anyone dry until they cut him off. What about her? I asked, keeping it casual. Jake paused, like he was picking his words. She's okay, I guess. Living in some tiny place near her folks. They're pissed at her for ditching Scott, though, stopped talking to her for a while. Guess they're mad she broke the golden rule. I snorted, picturing Marjorie and Tom clutching their pearls over their precious boy. Yeah, well, they'll get over it, I said. Or they won't. Not my problem. Jake laughed again. You sound good, man. Better than I've heard you in years. I smiled, taking another sip. I am good, I said, and meant it. We talked a bit more, about his job, my move, plans to grab drinks next weekend, then hung up. I set the phone down, feeling that peace again. Melanie had finally seen Scott for what he was, but it didn't change what she'd done to me. Her kicking him out was her win, not mine. My in-laws cutting me off? That was a blessing, not a loss. No more guilt trips, no more lectures. Just silence, and I loved it. Boston had been everything I'd hoped. The job was tough, but rewarding. Long hours, big projects, but I thrived on it. That corner office had a view of the Charles River, and I'd sit there sometimes, watching the water, feeling like I'd made it. I'd started hanging out with Jake and some other guys, old friends, new ones, grabbing beers after work, catching games. I even picked up the guitar again, jamming in my spare time, filling the apartment with chords I hadn't played since college. No one rolled their eyes or told me to stop. It was just me, doing what I wanted when I wanted. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights. The skyline sparkled, all sharp edges and glowing promise. This was my life now, career on track, friendships growing, peace I hadn't known in years. I wasn't the guy who came second anymore, the one who fixed everyone else's messes while they took the credit. I'd chosen myself, finally, and it was the best damn choice I'd ever made. Melanie and Scott could flail all they wanted. I wasn't their safety net. Not anymore. I thought back to that diner, to Scott's sneer, Melanie's tired eyes. She'd wanted me to see her trying, but all I'd seen was the same old chaos, just with a different spin. I didn't know her a second chance, didn't know him anything. I'd given enough, years of it, and got nothing back but grief. Now, standing here, I felt the difference. No more bending, no more shrinking. I was free, and it wasn't just about selling the house or moving away. It was about picking me, for once, and sticking to it. I finished my beer, set the bottle on the counter, and grabbed my jacket. Jake had mentioned a bar downtown, live music, good crowd, and I figured I'd meet him there. The night was mine, the city was mine, and I wasn't looking back. Scott could crash and burn. Melanie could rebuild or not. Her parents could stew in their own drama. I was out of it, thriving, living a life I'd built from the ground up. I locked the door behind me, stepped into the cool night, and smiled. This was what choosing myself felt like. Solid, real, and worth every second. And I was never giving it up.